Outlaws of Thunder Junction has just released, and as always here on the channel, we did a podcast covering our favorite commander cards from the set. And by we, I mean everybody but me, because I was busy at the time doing preview videos. Now that was kind of a bummer because I genuinely really love this set for commander. There are a ton of cards I'm super excited to get my hands on and start playing with, so not being in the podcast kind of sucked. But then I realized I could just make my own video and just talk about all my favorite cards in that video instead. So here we are. Here are my favorite cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction for Commander and the decks that I actually want to be playing them in. So first up, we've got Great Train Heist. This is a red spree card. It's a 1 red instant with spree. It has 3 modes. The first mode, you pay 2 and a red extra. Untap all creatures you control. If it's your combat phase, there is an additional combat after this phase. So it's an extra combat spell for 4 mana essentially at instant speed. Then you could play +2. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. And then 1 red, choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to that player this turn, create a tapped treasure token. So like all the spree cards, Great Train Heist is incredibly flexible in how you can use it. You can either take an extra combat phase, which I think is going to be the most powerful option of the 3. You can also give everything +1/+0 and first strike, which is a great combat trick or a great way to get some more damage through if you are on a go wide plan. And then the final option, for just 1 red mana, you can generate a ton of tapped treasure tokens if you are going wide as well too. But I think most of the power lies in that first ability. For a base cost of 4 mana, you get an extra combat phase. And 4 mana, take an extra combat is actually very decently costed. It's essentially Relentless Assault at instant speed. The only downside is Relentless Assault gives you an extra main phase after your additional combat phase, but that's not over super relevant. And then on top of that, if you spend more mana on Great Train Heist, you get even more rewards than the Relentless Assault. In that regard, it's kind of more equivalent to Savage Beating, another extra combat spell that I absolutely love. This one costs base of 5 mana for your extra combat, but if you entwine it for a total of 7, your extra combat also comes with double strike, which is absolutely fantastic, and that's more powerful than Great Train Heist giving +1/+0 and first strike to all your creatures until end of turn. So if you're trying to max out the amount of mana you're spending on either spell, Savage Beating is just more damage potential. However, Great Train Heist just has so much more flexibility. Like sometimes you're not in a position where you want an extra combat or like can really take advantage of an extra combat. Maybe you just want to generate a couple more treasures, honestly. You attack with like 4 creatures that are like 1/1s or whatever. You spend 2 mana and you make 4 treasure tokens to set you up for a following turn. That's already pretty darn good. 3 mana, you get an extra combat trick that can like kill some surprise attackers or whatever, which is really nice. So yeah, I love the flexibility of Great Train Heist. It has a lot of different uses outside of being just raw damage output. It also has some really cool potential with Sunforger. Since it's a 1 mana instant as its base rate, you can actually tutor it up with Sunforger. You still have to pay the additional spree cost, so you're not really saving mana, but the fact that you can always tutor up an extra combat spell with Sunforger is just fantastic in any deck that really wants to be running Sunforger decks, which are basically equipment decks that can equip the Sunforger for free. So personally speaking, I have a Sunforger deck. It's my Akiri Fearless Voyager Cauldron deck. It's an equipment deck. It runs all the ways of equipping Sunforger for free and all my other equipments for free. So being able to tutor up a Great Train Heist with Sunforger is already fantastic. And I already like Great Train Heist by itself anyway. I want to be running these 2 cards in the deck anyway. They just so happen to be even better when put together. Next, we've got Doc Aurlock, Grizzled Genius. This is a 2 mana Simic, 2/3 legendary creature bear druid. Spells you cast from your graveyard or from exile cost 2 less to cast, and plotting cards from your hand cost 2 less. So this card is 20 cents. It's a random uncommon from the main set, and it is bonkers. It's one of the best ramp potential cards in many different archetypes that they've ever printed. Like, just your spells cost 2 less to cast? That's insanity. That's really, really good for a 2-drop. So if you're in a deck that cares about plotting, like if you have Fibblethip in the 99, this obviously is going to work really, really well. If you cast spells from exile, let's say you're a theft deck, for example, and you're running Predator's Owl, you're casting spells that are exiled off your opponent's library, then that becomes absolutely fantastic. That's one of the greatest homes for this. And then also any type of graveyard deck, if you're casting spells with flashback, if you're in a Muldrotha deck, for example, where you're just casting stuff from your graveyard all the time, this is going to be absolutely fantastic there too. And personally, I have a budget Kellen the Kid deck that I recently built. I made a short on it very recently too. It works very, very well there too, because a lot of the spells you're going to be casting are from exile or from the graveyard. Those are just the most common things you're going to be doing with Kellen the Kid. So Doc Aurlock makes that way, way cheaper. And then one of my current favorite budget brews is a $10 Paco and Halden list. And Paco exiles cards from the top of everybody's library, and then Halden lets you cast them if they're non-creature spells. And again, Doc Aurlock is going to be fantastic there because it's just a huge ramp option. So yeah, Doc is great. It's less than a quarter right now, which is bananas considering just how powerful it is for a 2-drop. Next, we have Kambal Profiteering Mayor. This is a 3-mana Orzhov 2/4 legendary creature human advisor. It says whenever one or more tokens enter the battlefield under your opponent's control, for each of them create a tapped token that's a copy of it. This ability triggers only once each turn, and whenever one or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So in a current commander meta where everybody's generating treasure tokens and there's a lot of clue tokens running around, as well as food tokens, and obviously also just like random 1/1 creature tokens being made and all that good stuff, Kambal sits around on the table and just incidentally generates a ton of value off your opponents just doing regular commander things these days. And not only that, but also whenever you're making tokens or you're making tokens off your opponent's making tokens, you get to drain the table as well too. So not only is this a great way to profiteer off the current meta state of everybody generating tokens, everybody making treasures and all that good stuff, but also it furthers your own game plan too. If you're just making tokens, you get to drain your opponents too. That is a ton of value on a 3-drop. And you can use this card 2 different ways. First, I think this is interesting enough to be its own commander. You can run a lot of cards that are powerful but have a cost of requiring to give your opponents tokens. And with Kambal on the battlefield, yes, you're still giving your opponents tokens, but then you're doubling up on the tokens as well too, because you're getting a copy of those tokens as well. So something like Hunted Horror, the horror cycle, you get a big giant creature for a low mana cost, and then your opponents get some creatures, but then you get those tokens as well too. Same with Stradrix, you could like draw a card and then give somebody a Inkling or whatever, and then you get an Inkling as well too. That's amazing. Probably the biggest spice though is Wedding Ring. If you give somebody a Wedding Ring, then you get an extra copy of that Wedding Ring. So whenever you draw a card, they draw a card, and whenever they draw a card on their turn, you draw 2 cards. Same thing with Life Gain. Well, that's bananas. That actually makes Wedding Ring really, really powerful. But personally, I'm more excited in putting Kambal in the 99 of basically any Orzhov Plus token deck. I recently made a $25 Teyza Opulent Oligarch deck that's all about making a ton of clue tokens every single turn, and then also making a bunch of spirit tokens every single turn as well too. And Kambal is just going to be fantastic in this deck because the drain effect is incredibly powerful in Teyza. It will make sure I maximize the amount of clues I get to make every single turn. And then on top of that, whenever our opponents are making tokens as well, we get to profiteer off that too. So I think this card is just fantastic at the 99 of any token deck, really. Next up is Annie Joins Up. This is a 4-mana Naya legendary enchantment. And it says when it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. And if a triggered ability of a legendary creature you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So this is Panharmonicon for legendary creatures, and it also enters the battlefield, just deals 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker, which even in Commander, where we're battlecruiser magic and everything, that's still enough to kill most creatures on the battlefield. 4-mana Panharmonicons are the gold standard, and I think this card is going to be bananas in basically any Naya deck that has a commander with a very powerful triggered ability. So We've already seen Roaming Throne, right? It came out last year, and basically every single Typal deck is running Roaming Throne because every single Typal deck has a lot of triggered abilities, and then doubling up those triggered abilities, turns out, is incredibly powerful for 4 mana. But I've also seen Roaming Throne starting to be slotted in basically just any commander that has a very powerful triggered ability that's powerful enough that you're willing to spend a card and 4 mana to double up its trigger. And I think the same thing is going to be happening with Annie. If you're in a Naya deck, it doesn't have to be a Legendary Creature Matters deck, for example. It just has to have a Naya plus Legendary Creature with a powerful triggered ability. And I think that's going to be good enough to slot in Annie just on the chance that you can double up its powerful trigger, because even by itself, it's doing something. It's still ETB taking out a creature too, so it is removal on its own. Obviously though, if you want the best home for Annie joins up, it's going to be a Legendary Creatures Matters decks. And in Naya colors, the only one that I could think of is Joda the Unifier. Obviously, doubling up your Joda triggers and all your other legendary creature triggers is utterly bananas, and it's also a legendary permanent itself too, so it also triggers Joda, which is fantastic. Next, we have Satoru the Infiltrator. This is a 2-mana Dimir 2/3 legendary creature human ninja rogue. It has menace, and whenever it and or one or more other non-token creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if none of them were cast or no mana was spent to cast them, draw a card. So for 2 mana, you can start drawing a lot of cards. So out of all the new legendary creatures that can be your commander from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, I'm actually the most excited for Satoru the Infiltrator. And the reason is because I really like ninjas as an archetype. And ninjas have always had a problem for me trying to build a casual ninja deck, I would say, because either the ninjas are too powerful with the current commanders we have, or they just aren't good as a ninja commander. And the reason is the previous 2 ninja commanders just didn't really work well with me at my casual play groups. The problem with Yuriko, for example, the de facto ninja commander, is that she's just way too strong for casual tables. She's too cheap, she's too efficient, and she's too resilient to removal for a lot of casual decks to actually handle her. And the fact that her triggered ability not just draws you cards, but also draws you cards while also being the finisher of the deck is just too much. It's an incredibly powerful deck. It's basically guaranteed to be at least high power and or CDH potential, essentially. So if you want to just make a fun little ninja deck, I don't think Yuriko's a really good option for that because she's just too strong. And then the other ninja commander we had more recently was Satoru Umezawa, but this one doesn't actually want you to be running ninjas, really. The exact opposite, actually. It rewards you instead for running really big haymaker finisher creatures and just turning them into honorary ninjas, like the honorary Hokage of the clan basically is now Blightsteel Colossus, and it's just kind of not a ninja deck. It's not what I wanted. So Satoru the Infiltrator, though, is exactly what I wanted at a much more chill rate. Whenever you ninjutsu in a ninja, you get to draw a card with Satoru. That's the main goal. You get to draw cards other different ways as well too, but in a ninja deck, like you ninjutsu, you draw a card for 2 mana, that's fantastic. That's exactly what I want. It's also a ninja in the command zone, so it benefits from ninja synergies. It's strong, it's good, it's reliable, but it's not oppressive like Yuriko, and doesn't want you to run non-ninjas like Satoru Umezawa. So I love this one. But I'm even more excited to run Satoru in the 99 of a bunch of decks. So it works well with ninjutsu, but the way the card is worded, it's more flexible on how it draws cards. For example, if you're in a blink deck like Amanatu the Fate Shifter, whenever you're blinking a creature, you're not spending mana to cast it again, you draw a card, which is super awesome. Obviously, also, if you are in a Joda the Unifier deck, whenever you're triggering Joda, you don't actually pay any mana to cast the legendary creatures, so Satoru just triggers and draws you a card as well too, so it's an excellent 2-drop in Joda. But my personal favorite is I have an Etrata Deadly Fugitive deck, and it's all about playing assassins and then attacking with assassins and manifesting creatures off the top of your opponent's library. So those face-down creatures, it doesn't really matter what the face-down card is, they enter as creatures and don't spend any mana to put them onto the battlefield under your control. So every single Etrata trigger will also draw you a card with Satoru, which is absolutely bonkers. It's fantastic. It's the best card draw engine in the entire deck, and I absolutely love it. And yeah, it's $8, so it's on the more expensive end compared to the other stuff, but in my personal list, I'm going to splurge a little bit, I'm going to upgrade it a little bit, and Satoru definitely is the first card I'm throwing into the deck. Next, we've got one of the best new catch-up ramp cards in white, and that is Sand Scout. This is a 2-mana, 1 and a white, 2/2 creature human scout, and it says when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a desert card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and whenever one or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, create a 1/1 red, green, and white Sand Warrior creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So the first ability of Sand Scout is something we've seen a couple times before in white for catch-up ramp. The original version of this, I believe, is Knight of the White Orchid. It's a 2-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, if your opponent has more lands than you get to search up a plains card. So you get a plains, it could be like a plateau, it could be a dual plains or whatever. That's really good. And it enters the battlefield untapped, which is a nice little perk. But Sand Scout has a lot more inherent flexibility on the cool things you can grab. It's limited to only deserts, but we have an entire cycle of deserts that actually mana fix for you. They all enter tap, they all ping, they're like the Abraded Bluffs, and that's all well and sweet. There's a couple other utility lands too, outside of the mana fixing ones that are deserts, that are really useful, but the best one is Arid Archway. Just imagine this. You Sand Scout, you're one behind on land or whatever. You Sand Scout, you ramp out an Arid Archway, enters the battlefield, and it returns another land you control back to your hand. It's a bounce land. That means your further catch-up ramp cards are still all online. If you blink the Sand Scout, for example, you're still going to be one behind your opponent. So you didn't go up a land, so you can get another desert out of Sand Scout. Or you can go like Sand Scout, Arid Archway, into next turn, like Knight of the White Orchid, get another land onto the battlefield too. So I love the fact that you can go Sand Scout into Arid Archway, and you don't go up in lands, so all your other catch-up ramp is still online. That's super awesome. And then its secondary ability is also very good. It works very well with all the fetch lands, so even if like you're a mono white deck or something, or a Boros deck, you can run all the fetch lands in your color, and then whenever you're cracking fetch lands, you get to generate a bunch of 1/1 creatures, which is amazing. That's super, super good. It's also really good in like self-mill and anything that can sacrifice lands for value, so it has a lot of different applications, but just the first primary trigger is the one I'm most excited for. If you want to focus on its secondary ability, which is really, really strong, obviously decks that can self-mill or sacrifice lands for value like Yuma, the deck that it was designed for, is going to be the ideal home for it. But I'm personally just super hyped about that first ability, the white catch-up ramp. And basically any of my white decks that don't have green in them, that don't have other sources of a lane ramp, I'm just going to jam it in there. So for example, I have a Selenia Dark Angel deck. I'm just going to jam the Sand Scout in there, like, why not? Next up, we got a cool little uncommon. This is another spree card. It's Requisition Raid. So it starts at 1 white mana. It's a sorcery, and the spree cost, each one is just 1 additional mana. So for 1 additional mana, you can destroy target artifact, and then 1 additional mana, destroy target enchantment, and 1 additional mana, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. So for 2 mana, this is a sorcery speed disenchant, which is not exciting at all. However, 3 mana, destroy an artifact and destroy an enchantment is already a pretty darn good rate. And then 4 mana, destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, and if you have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, you just put a bunch of +1/+1 counters on them. That's actually amazing. That's really good. And the flexibility here is fantastic. Sometimes you just want to disenchant something. You just want to spend 2 mana and get something out of the battlefield. But, you know, the more mana you put into this, the more mana efficient I believe it becomes, and just the better of a card it becomes. So this is just really, really nice, really mana efficient, and very flexible. So basically any go wide deck, I think will like Requisition Raid, honestly. Like the more creatures you have, the better its final ability is. And any deck wants to have interaction, wants to be able to blow up artifacts or enchantments. I think the ideal home, though, is going to be Hamza, Guardian of Irration. You want to go wide, but you also want to have +1/+1 counters on all your creatures to maximize Hamza's ability. So this does both. So it's just a slam dunk there. And I have a $25 Hamza brew. I'm going to put it in there. It's a 43-cent card. It's probably going to go down as well. Next up, we have Honest Rutstein. This is another uncommon that I think is just dirt cheap and very good. It's a 3-mana Golgari, 3/2 legendary creature human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This card is just so mana efficient and so good in a deck that is very, very creature heavy. I'm talking like 40 or more creatures, which I actually have a bunch of those in green. This is a fantastic ramp engine, but then it's also a 3-mana like Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness, more flexible, obviously. It can return any card from your graveyard to your hand, but if you're in like a super heavy creature deck, which a lot of green decks are these days, honestly, you will be getting basically the same thing off the Ewit as you would with the Honest Rutstein. It's going to be a creature card, right? And then, on top of that, your creature spells cost 1 less to cast, so it's just fantastic ramp in that particular deck. So it's just, in a creature-heavy deck, I think Honest Rutstein is just way, way better than Eternal Witness, and Eternal Witness is already a good card. In terms of specific decks that can really utilize Honest Rutstein, if you have any decks that particularly care about having creatures in the graveyard, either because you're milling them or you're sacrificing them, then Honest Rutstein's first ability becomes just more consistent. But you don't really need to have that ability. But if you really want to maximize his ability, focus on creature-heavy decks that sacrifice or self-mill, like Carador, Ghost Chieftain, Henzi, Toolbox Torre, or Smeagol. Like all of those, this is just a slam dunk in. Then we've got Smuggler's Surprise, another spree card. Turns out the spree cards are really good. It's a green mana instant and has spree cost of either +2, mill 4 cards. You may put up to 2 creature cards and or land cards from among the mill cards into your hand. +5, 4 in green. You may put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And then +1, creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Now, this card has a ton of flexibility. The first two options, the first option is basically like card advantage. You mill, and then you get to put creatures and or lands into your hand. So that's card advantage. 5 mana. The +5 ability, rather, you get to ramp out big creatures from your hand onto the battlefield. So if you have a lot of really high cost creatures, this ability is going to be worth it. And then finally, the +1 ability is the one that I'm actually the most excited for. Essentially, for green and a colorless, 2 mana total, creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. If you're in a go tall, like stompy style deck, being able to spend 2 mana to give all your creatures essentially heroic intervention is really good when you have a heroic intervention that allows you to do 2 other abilities as well when you need it. Like that is amazing. So I think this card is just going to be a slam dunk in basically any deck that is go tall. I would even go as far as to say is if you're in a green deck that has a commander with power 4 or greater and you really want that commander to live, then you probably could just run Smuggler's Surprise as a secondary heroic intervention as well too. But in go tall decks, it's really going to be the most powerful. So like my Galta deck is going to love it here, and then if you're in like the Gitrog, Ravenous Rod, you'll love it there as well too. Then we've got a new mono black, I would say generic stable. This is Insatiable Avarice, another spree card. Surprise, surprise. So it's a 1 black sorcery with spree. The +2 ability is search your library for a card, then shuffle and put that card on top. And then the other ability, double black, is target player draws 3 cards and loses 3 life. To me, this card is basically the second spree ability. It's for 3 mana, triple black, target player draws 3 cards and loses 3 life. That already makes this card more than worth it. And then the second ability is nice if you have extra mana, essentially. I see this as essentially the next step up from like Sign in Blood. Pay 2 mana, draw 2, that's fine. But I much prefer paying 3 mana, draw 3, like Painful Truth. I absolutely love Painful Truth. I still run it in 3 color decks and above to this day. So for mono black to have a mono black version of Painful Truths, I absolutely love. And then also because you're in mono black, you generally have like Kambal Coffers and stuff. You can generate a ton of black mana. So in the early to mid game, you're probably just going to be paying 3 mana to draw 3, pay 3. And that's really, really good. And then in the late game, when you have extra mana, you can search your library for a card and then immediately draw it with the second ability as well too by paying an additional 2 mana on top of the 3, so 5 total. That's really strong. This is a really, really strong card. I have one mono black deck in my paper collection, and that is Toshiro Umezawa, and while it is not an instant, it is still more than powerful enough for me to jam it into the deck. It is a Kambal Coffers deck, so it generates a ton of mana, and then utilizes that mana to win the game, and Insatiable Avarice fits that very perfectly. All right, now we're gonna get a little bit more narrow on my favorite cards, because these are gonna be cards that like fit like an exactly one deck. So Shifting Grift. 2 mana, spree card. Yes, it's another spree card. Double blue, sorcery, spree, 3 abilities, +2, exchange control of 2 target creatures, +1, exchange control of 2 target artifacts, and +1, exchange control of 2 target enchantments. So this is just a switcheroo card. I love switcheroo cards in exactly one deck, but this one is one of the best ones they've ever printed. The most comparable options are like Ledgerman and Juxtapose. Ledgerman can swap an artifact or a creature. So it does it actually more efficiently if you're swapping artifacts, and it does it at the same rate if you're swapping creatures. And then Juxtapose is a little bit more weird. It can actually swap creatures and artifacts in the same spell, so it's incredibly mana efficient, but the mana value has to be less than or equal to the thing you're trying to swap with. So it has more restrictions, and it's a little bit worse because of that. But if you're comparing it to either of these cards, Shifting Grift is just way better, right? Like, it's already straight up better than Ledgerman because it has more options, more abilities, and it's better than Juxtapose because even if, you know, it costs more mana to swap 2 things around, you don't have that mana value restriction. So you can always swap your like 1/1 creature token with your opponent's 5 mana commander and make them super miserable and you super happy. And the best home for Shifting Grift, I think it's actually playable in token decks, but the best home is obviously Zedrud the Great-Hearted. Zedrud was my very first paper commander deck. It's the first deck that I ever had going into the format, starting with the Precon in 2011, and I've had it to this day, and my goodness, this is the best card they've printed this year and maybe last year as well too. This card is fantastic. All right, and those are my top favorite cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction for Commander. I actually have a bunch of other cards too that I really like, but they're also very, very specific cards for my weird, very specific niche Commander decks. Like, there's a bunch of 6-drops that I really like, only because there's 6 drops and I put them in 6-drop tribal. Like, that is how narrow we are talking here. And I figured most people are just not interested in that. That's just a me thing. So I didn't want to bore everybody here. So we're going to leave it here. Hopefully the cards that I talked about resonate with a lot more people. Let me know your favorite cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction as well too, and what homes you want to put them in. I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts, and maybe there's some cool cards that I overlooked. There's so many cards being printed these days. There's no way I can keep up with it, and I'm a full-time content creator, so let me know if there's any cool stuff that I missed. That's all for now, and until next time, friends, see ya!